Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced by North Idaho College located on Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guests.
Welcome to our second week in our special series titled Americans' 225-Year Journey in Search of Personal Freedoms. Last week we heard from Dr. Clay Jenkinson bringing all this together on these 5 different special times in our history. But today we are going to invite to the program in Chautauqua format President Thomas Jefferson. One of those very special times in history was the writing and signing of the Declaration of Independence and our independence, which leads us into other issues, other weeks on this program about different ways that we've gone about guaranteeing personal freedoms for Americans. Mr. President, welcome to the program. We're pleased to have you here, and we know that you are the architect of the Declaration of Independence and that you were President of the United States and the founder of the University of Virginia, and also an architect of the rights in the state of Virginia. And so we're so pleased to have you with us. Since we've had you before on our program, welcome back.
Thanks very much. I just want to say right off the beginning that the Declaration of Independence is an expression of a world movement for liberty, which had one of its flowerings in the United States in 1776.
And after your time, Mr. President, I've had the opportunity to talk to people in the Union of South Africa when they wrote their Charter of Freedom. They were patterned that after the Declaration of Independence as an example.
And I take no credit for that of any sort, because the Declaration of Independence is really a statement of universal law. In other words, any rational being would have come up with much the same philosophy of natural right had he been asked. I happen to be one articulator of that, but the British Civil War led to the British Bill of Rights. The Magna Carta is a very early, kind of inchoate form of the same. The rights tradition is really written in the human heart, and it's for discoverers or philosophers to excavate that tradition and to place it on a pedestal and say, this is the standard by which all societies will be judged.
Thank you. And with that, I welcome to the program our panelists, Janelle Burke. And Janelle, over the last few years, we've been able to welcome a number of people from history in this format, and so we'll invite you to ask questions now.
Yes, Mr. Jefferson, as you noted, the Declaration of Independence didn't arise in a vacuum. There were events that led up to it. Can you describe what you think were the seminal events that led up to the Declaration of Independence?
I'd be happy to. They're of two sorts. One is the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was born in Scotland and France and to a certain degree England, and it flowered. It believed that man is a rational creature, that we can improve our world, that we have a right to investigate nature, that good sense is more important than metaphysics. It was frankly skeptical of all received traditions, including the official traditions of the Christian Church. That's one movement, and we were a product of it. More specifically, the United Colonies had been betrayed by the British Crown. Britain had played a relatively indifferent role in the settling of America. It left us alone, but suddenly when it became useful for its own sense of itself and for the production of revenue, Britain got more interested in the colonies, began to grind us to powder, to tax us without proper representation, to quarter troops amongst us, and so on. And we considered ourselves good British citizens. We were patient. But finally, in 1775 and 1776, we realized that patience was no longer a virtue. It showed us to deserve enslavement, and that we now had no choice morally but to stand up as citizens of the world and even as citizens of the British tradition and demand a due respect for our rights.
Now, you were certainly not the only person who was involved in this process. There were a number of other people. Who do you consider to be the most important movers in this project?
John Adams, principally. John Adams said, and I think he's right, that the revolution really was won before the Declaration of Independence was drafted. That the revolution was a changing of the hearts and minds of Americans who wanted to be loyal British citizens, but who reluctantly agreed to be something else. Eventually, in early June 7th of 1776, we resolved independence, and then a committee was established to draft a document to provide legal formality to this, and I was on that committee. The committee consisted of 5, but it was soon reduced to 3, and the 3 of us were Dr. Franklin, the greatest American, John Adams, the most active rebel, and I, the shy penman and scholar from Virginia.
When the document was written, you have indicated, Mr. President, that in our time, in the 21st century, that we stress a different portion of the document than you did in your time, that the preamble to us is, or the introduction, is what we so focus on, and yet in your time it was other parts of the document. Would you explain?
Well, if you go to court even in your own day and present an argument to a judge or a jury and say interesting philosophical things and flowery statements of rhetoric, they're going to dismiss that and say, what we want is the facts. What we want is the indictment. What we're looking for is the case you can make, not some sort of philosophical positioning that you might present. So the preamble is really the philosophical base, and it's, I think, justly famous in your time. I will take some credit for having written it well, but it was considered Enlightenment boilerplate, effectively. It was an intro. The body of the Declaration of Independence is the 18-point indictment of the behavior of the British Parliament and the behavior of the British Crown. Let me just give you an example. Stirring up Indians in the West. The British stirred up Indians in the West to massacre our settlers. What rational parent country would ever do that? The British would not allow us to be tried by juries of our peers here. They stripped us of our rights, took us bodily across the ocean where we were tried by British juries, prejudiced against us. Troops were quartered in our homes without our consent and without just compensation. A whole range of these abuses, and if you add them up, any one of them probably acceptable, disagreeable, but probably endurable, but you add them up and they produce a pattern of despotism and tyranny. And once that pattern becomes clear, rational beings must respond, and eventually we did. And so the Declaration of Independence is a syllogism. It says under certain conditions people have a right to overthrow their government. Those conditions have been amply met. We therefore reluctantly now overthrow our parent government and create our own.
Albert.
How much agreement and disagreement was there in the writing of the Declaration of Independence? Certainly there had to be some discussion about certain points. How much agreement and disagreement was there?
Excellent question. There are 2 types of disagreement. One was the philosophical disagreement about whether we should break from Great Britain. And let me just say, it is true that most revolutions are inaugurated by a cadre of aristocrats or intellectuals. That certainly was the case in ours, and I will say reluctantly, but I think candidly, that if we had taken a plebiscite of the American people in 1776, the great majority would have wanted to work it out with Britain, that there was not a consensus for independence. In fact, the independence movement was really pushed onto a reluctant population by men like myself. But time was on our side on that question. As to the specifics, the Declaration of Independence was very hotly contested. For one thing, I had put in it, in the center, an anti-slavery clause, which accused George III of waging war against human nature itself by perpetuating the illegal slave trade. I felt we must take on this issue too, that we can't just declare ourselves independent and then own slaves. We have to face this, and face it sooner rather than later. So the longest single paragraph in the Declaration is a violent, passionate attack on slavery, at least on the slave trade. But it was expunged because South Carolina and Georgia, certain New England slave trading states, made it clear that they would not ratify the document if that offensive paragraph were left in it. We needed unanimity and consensus, and so we dropped it. But we lost an enormously important opportunity there. Then they mangled my text. I'm very thin-skinned about things like this. I'm sure you are too. I wrote it, and I was very proud of it, and I felt that it was the right statement. And then the wits of Congress and the ambitious men and the statesmen in their pontificating Ciceronian fashion stood up to object to this comma and that clause and that metaphor. And by the time all the mangling was done, a quarter of the document was missing. I had to sit there in absolute silence and listen to this, because as a gentleman, I could not leave. That would be ungentlemanly. But as a gentleman, I could not debate. because that would be to defend my own draft. And so I had to sit there and listen to this, and it was excruciating. It was one of the most painful experiences of my whole life, and I have to say I never really forgave it, and I to this day believe that my draft was superior to the thing that was adopted on the 4th of July.
Was it difficult to sign? Was it difficult to get people to sign? Were they fearful of reprise, something against them if they did sign it? How much of a courage did it take to sign the Declaration of Independence?
First of all, an interesting little historical fact, we didn't sign it on the 4th of July because once we had adopted it, it had to go to a printer, and then it went to an engraver, to a calligrapher, and the famous copy that you all celebrate wasn't signed until August, and then it wasn't signed in a ceremony. It was signed as we came and left the room. So whatever picture you have of us all standing around with our pens watching John Hancock is a lovely myth. It cost us something to sign it. I mean, my mother, for example, wondered why I would want to jeopardize the future of my family in taking on this extreme position. Had we been caught, had the revolution failed, theoretically we could have been executed. Probably we wouldn't have been, but it certainly wouldn't have been a good time for any of us. And I remember one of the big fat men from Virginia turned to Elbridge Gerry, who was a teeny little man, and said, "I shall have the advantage of you, Citizen Gerry, if we're all hanged, because I will die instantly, but your tiny body will dangle endlessly in the ropes before you are suffocated." So there was some gallows humor about all of this, but we knew we would win. We knew that our cause was just, that once people know liberty, they will not ever sleep until their liberty is secure.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson.
You've already touched, Mr. President, on some of the very difficult decisions were made in the document itself. But would you share with us how the fact that your paragraph was omitted that did condemn King George III for slave trade, and how then the struggle went over to the Constitution, which we'll have on this program later, and our guest in Chautauqua format will be President George Washington, who chaired the convention. How would history have been so different if you, as a group of lovers of independence from the British, had handled that issue differently?
We certainly would be less excoriated by the righteous beings of your own day. You know, in your time, the righteous are looking back on us as contemptible hypocrites and bigots and racists and so on, and some of this is true. So we would have liked to be more pure. It's one thing to accept life as a muddle, but if you're going to say all men are created equal, you had better watch the mirror very closely, and we failed. There's no question about that. I can only say this. I'd be very interested to hear what George Washington has to say. He was practically more of an abolitionist than I was. You know, he freed his slaves at the death of his wife. His will made sure that all of them were freed and pensioned, given a stipend so that they could get along in the world. I never was able to do that. I only freed 8 slaves in the course of my life out of the 200 or so that I owned, and I wasn't really in favor of a point-by-point emancipation. I thought we needed general abolition. I'd be very interested to have a dialogue with President Washington about that, and I was not at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. I was in Europe, but this is what I know. 1776, we faced the issue of slavery. It turns out to be too central, too volatile, too incendiary, and so we postpone it. We try to muddle through, hope for the best. And then in 1787, the Constitution is drafted, and slavery was a much larger issue at that conference than it was in Philadelphia for the Declaration of Independence, because now we're talking about who's a citizen and who's not, how you apportion representation, how you apportion taxation, and so on. And slavery came up again and again and again as the kind of silent poison or acid destroying the idea of a republic. And finally, the good men, the 55 demigods who met in Philadelphia, decided that they were going to have to paper this over. And so, as you know, the word slavery never appears in the Constitution, and yet slavery is talked about 8 times in the Constitution. And this was our generation's way of hoping that it would go away, but facing the practical truth that if slavery weren't compromised in this way, there could have been no Constitution of the United States. That the South would have formed its own republic, the North would have formed its own republic. this would have balkanized America and probably doomed our experiment to a failure. And so we hoped that if we could pretend that slavery wouldn't destroy us and postpone it to some indefinite future, that it would go away all by itself. And as you know, that was a short-sighted, tragic decision. But I invite you to think of the alternative. What if we had gone to the wall on slavery in 1787? Probably there would have been no union. The result would have been unspeakable.
If you had been successful in getting that paragraph in the Declaration of Independence, would you have the same end result that a number of the people at the Continental Congress would not have signed the document?
Yes, it would. I probably wouldn't have ratified. I did sneak in a very interesting phrase. You have to admit that the phrase "all men are created equal" is the first draft of the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, nobody really understood this at the time, but if you put in a very broad philosophical statement of right, so vague that in a sense it seems to be meaningless, it can come to have meaning in the course of time. This was, I don't like to talk about my own capacities, but if I had genius, this was it. To always see through the immediate to the universal, to plant revolutionary ideas in seemingly blasé language that would come back to change the world later on. Let me give you an example of how this works. The Northwest Ordinance in 1787 forbade slavery to move into the Ohio Valley, and it never did. Think of how ideas matter and how legislation matters. I had tried that in 1784 with a bill for the government of the Western Territories which forbade slavery to cross the Appalachians anywhere in America, and that bill failed by one vote. If I had had that vote in Congress, we might have contained slavery on the eastern seaboard, which might have prevented the Civil War, might have changed the whole history of humanity, but we couldn't find that vote. But in 1787, with the Northwest Ordinance, there were enough votes to keep it at least out of the Ohio Valley, and that changed the course of American history and gave the abolitionist movement a fertile ground on which to plant itself across the Ohio from slaveholding Kentucky. So if I could have gotten that passage into the Declaration of Independence, it might have solved the problem. But the fact is, I wasn't gifted enough as a strategist, or it was an idea before its time, or I don't know how to analyze it.
Also, you, I think, have spoken, Mr. President, before to this issue in your time, and you did have some very deep concern about this, or you wouldn't have written that paragraph about George III. It was part of your desire and hope that slavery would not win out, that it would gradually just die out. And would that not have probably happened if it hadn't been for the invention of the cotton gin?
Might well have. The cotton gin, by making cotton so easy to produce, created a boom, one of the first real booms in our economy in the Southwest, in Alabama and in Florida and Georgia and Mississippi and Louisiana. And cotton required slave labor, at least it did then. And the cotton boom was such an economic event, really a phenomenon, that it gave slavery a second front. We thought, as long as slavery was tied to tobacco and to the eastern seaboard, the Tidewater region, I mean, really, in 1787 or so, we would have thought rational beings will not use tobacco much longer. Why would anyone ingest something that's so baleful? So we didn't understand what was coming.
Janelle Burke.
You wrote the Declaration of Independence, and it was adopted, and then you traveled to Europe. Mm-hmm. Was there much interest in the Declaration of Independence in Europe, and what did the thinking people of Europe believe about it?
Well, first of all, the thinking people of Europe were on our side, but they also were skeptical. They thought this little banana republic, these provincial farmers thinking that they can actually create a republic. There was a lot of derision and contempt for the American idea. And people thought that this was a useful little experiment that would surely fail, and then we would go on being a typical sort of colonial nation of some sort. Lafayette, the great French freedom fighter, had a copy of the Declaration of Independence in a frame on his wall, and then next to it, a blank frame. And when asked, he would say, that's where the French Declaration of the Rights of Man is going to go when we get serious about human liberty. And as you know, this happened. And when the Declaration of the Rights of Man was written, I was there. I was the ambassador to France, and Lafayette called me in, and I helped him to draft one of the early versions of the of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, a much more sweeping document than our Declaration of Independence. And so that's why I say we lived in a time of almost global ferment, in which all these ideas were percolating up, and we thought that the world was going to change, first the United States, then France, then Britain, then Spain, then Italy, and eventually every nation would be a liberal democracy of some sort. So we had a lot of enthusiasm for this, but I'll tell you quickly, in France, the Declaration of Independence was much less central than my Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty. When I got to France, people said, that document that says man is utterly free in his conscience, that's the most important document in human history, and they scarcely recognize the Declaration of Independence.
Well, Mr. Jefferson, that leads me to the second part of my question, and that is, were certain freedoms in your day more desired than others? Which of the freedoms, if you could put them in a hierarchy, were the most important?
I can tell you what the number one freedom is. It's the freedom of absolute liberty of brain, of mind. If the mind is free to think what it thinks and read what it wants and express what it wishes, all other freedoms will inevitably follow. The most important thing we can do is to educate the mind, to inculcate critical thinking skills in it, and then to liberate it, to look at the world, and to take every idea and put it in the balance and say, is this a good idea or is this nonsense? Is this truth or is this superstition? And to liberate the mind to become its own tool to discriminate its way through life. That's the fundamental freedom. It comes through education, but it also comes from disestablishing official churches and having a First Amendment or something like it that enables people to express whatever comes to their mind that doesn't lead to social chaos.
Now that you're visiting in our time, things have changed tremendously, and there's been a civil war, and slavery fortunately was abolished, and even at a later time in some famous court cases, legalized segregation has been declared unconstitutional. It's because of something in the U.S. Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments after the Civil War. And in the 14th Amendment, there is a provision that's been used extensively saying that no person should be denied equal protection of the laws. So going back to your very clever way of putting into the Declaration the equality question, what do you believe that particular clause influenced later the writing of that very, very significant amendment to the Constitution?
It's hard for me to know. Of course, I died in 1826, right. But I do know this much, that Abraham Lincoln, who is the 16th president and whose presidential policies I would have disagreed with profoundly, but Lincoln in effect rehabilitated me because he read the Declaration of Independence in a series of letters in the 1850s in which he said if Jefferson meant anything, he must have meant everything. And if he didn't mean everything, we have to read it as universal, because we cannot go on as a nation unless we read this statement, all men are created equal, in the broadest possible fashion. And when Elizabeth Cady Stanton at Seneca Falls decided to assert the rights of women in 1848, she went straight back to the Declaration of Independence and said all men and women are created equal, and tried to universalize that statement for gender. And your Martin Luther King in 1963, and maybe the most extraordinary reinterpretation of that statement in American history, said on the Mall in Washington, from the beginning of American history, the Founding Fathers issued this promissory note, all men are created equal. He said, we Negroes have gone with that promissory note to the Bank of American Justice again and again and again, and every time we have ever gone, it has been returned for insufficient funds. He said, now we are taking that promissory note to the bank, and this time you are going to cash it. And he got away with it. Why? Because he was a great leader, but also because he went back to the well of the deepest springs of American aspiration and American idealism, and showed that what he was proposing for blacks was implicit in the very founding documents of American culture. And so they both, Lincoln and Martin Luther King, redeemed my reputation from the Southern provincialism into which it might have fallen without their rereadings of this statement.
I think that's just a fascinating statement. And Mr. Jefferson, the fact that you did put that in there, even though you failed on getting the other paragraph dealing with the issue of slavery, I just wonder if you did not have a visionary way of looking at it. That clause, without that clause in the Declaration, Abraham Lincoln and Dr. Martin Luther King and Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton and others would have certainly crusaded and they could have had hopefully the success we have, but that gave them philosophical power. And so how would you react to that? It was a remarkable clause to get in there. Again, the delegates could interpret a different way, and I'm sure many of them thought this was white men's equality. But
they certainly did.
But you really provided, in a very wonderful way, ammunition for the future.
Well, it's the oracle of reason. Let's just reason about this for 1 minute. Let's put a Negro here and a woman here and a poor white man here and a mentally retarded person here and an American Indian here, and you look at them and you think, which of these should have more rights than others? The minute you look at it rationally, you realize, of course, they're all human beings. Because they're all human beings, they should all have identical rights. Then you think, well, why don't they? When you step to that point, you realize they don't, because we have artificially corrupted the social order and we have created hierarchies that don't stand up to reason. And so once you start down this process of rational analysis, believing that humans have rights, well, who is a human? Is a Sioux Indian a human? Yes. Is a black woman a human? Well, yes. Once you start down that process, it just pushes you along and along and along until you wind up granting rights to everyone. So what we did was we launched the phrase, and then American history is the slow application of that principle until in your day it's getting close. It's not there yet, but it's getting close to actually covering the spectrum of humanity in America. I don't speak for Mexico or Arabia or Bangladesh, but in America. And in America, you've gone even one step farther. At the end of the 20th century, you began to knock at the doors of non-human species and say, maybe a river has rights, maybe a redwood has rights, maybe a grizzly bear has rights.
On that note, Mr. President, we have to bring our program to conclusion. On behalf of Janelle Burke and our staff, we thank you, President Thomas Jefferson, for these enlightening comments, and thank you for coming back and visiting with us again from the past. Ladies and gentlemen, next week we will continue our special series that's titled Americans' 225-Year Journey in Search of Personal Freedoms, and our guest will be Thomas Paine, who was one of the very influential writers during this historical time that resulted in a revolution and a new country and a new government. I'm very much urging you to be with us as we continue this series with famous people in history. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running entirely college-produced program on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us again at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.